BTW kalau live streaming kesimpan kan itu videonya? Iya sih?
Kenapa?
Kalau live streaming kesimpan kan video live?
Kesimpan kok.
Oke.
Ini udah streaming lagi.
Nah,
Ke covernya aja sih.
Welcome to Indonesian Economic Review 6.0. Indonesian Economic Review or IER is a big event from Economic Department of Pertamina University that held every year. This year will be the 6 years of IER, and today IER 6.0 held online webinar with ASEAN scale. IER 6.0 present online webinar that held 2 days with English speaker and Bahasa speaker. The webinar has the theme ASEAN's Economic Community in 2021 Prospect and Challenges. Today's speakers: Mr. Jan Menon as Visiting Senior Fellow at Institute of Southeast ASEAN Studies, Mr. Chris Humphrey as Executive Director at EU ASEAN Business Council. Don't forget to follow this webinar until the end, and thank you for joining this event.
Coba.
Kenapa?
Ya, coba stop share bentar, Cir. Oke, teman-teman. Ini udah pada joinnya semuanya, kurang lebih. Nah, buat yang siapa lagi? Mungkin yang backup share screen belum ya. Kita tunggu lagi. Nah, buat teman-teman, sekali lagi buat namanya, formatnya ganti ya guys, nama _ panitia. Tapi itu buat yang itu aja, buat yang megang teknis gitu. Kalau yang biasa, maksudnya kalau yang nggak ada megang teknis, kalian bisa namain kayak biasa aja, nama _ Universitas Pertamina gitu aja. Oke. Terus buat co-host.
Belum mulai, doa dulu deh. Pimpin doa aja.
Bentar.
Udah enak nih. Biar lancar jaya.
Ini safety nggak bisa dihubungin lagi. Bentar ya guys.
Siapa yang nggak bisa dihubungin?
Safety yang buat ngehandle Kak Audrey.
Tapi kemarin udah dikirim informasinya gitu kan?
Udah sih. Takutnya udah dikirim Zoom dan lain-lain sih. Jaga-jaga.
Oke. Oke, aku pimpin doa deh, sebagai ketua.
Boleh.
Teman-teman, sebelum kita mulai, alangkah baiknya kita berdoa sesuai agama dan kepercayaan masing-masing. Semoga cara kita lancar untuk hari pertama, tidak ada suatu kendala apapun. Berdoa mulai. Ini doa tidak pernah selesai. Oke. Semangat guys, semangat Agung yang handle hari ini. Keren banget Agung, udah rapi.
Mantap. Oke teman-teman, sekali lagi mungkin reminder ya teman-teman. Kita kan acara ini perdana. It's okay kalau kalian masih gugup, tapi usahain semaksimal mungkin, setenang mungkin, biar pas acara nggak ada slack-slack yang parah gitu. Nah, buat teman-teman nih, Agung mungkin, terus dari Bocil juga, dari Dea mungkin juga, dan lain-lain. Kalau nanti ada kesalahan, minor kesalahan mungkin, usahain buat tenang dulu, kita koordinasi langsung di grup seminar, biar semuanya tahu, oke? Nanti saling bantu backup, semuanya udah ada backup kan? Agung udah ada Lucy, karena Bocil juga ada yang backup. Nah, Catherine sama Iklim juga tolong standby buat itu ya. Buat
Kak.
Buat PPT. Oke. Oh iya, Cil, lo PPT itu udah prepare belum, Cil? Yang jangan enak.
Udah.
Oke, siap. Kalau nanti dia minta bantuin, langsung share aja ya.
Ya.
Oke, sip. Nah, buat teman-teman panitia nanti, kalau apa ya? Kalau bisa on cam, biar kita kelihatan rame. Sayang juga kan kita udah bikin virtual background banyak-banyak, terus nggak on cam, nggak udah punya juga. Biar rame juga, biar smart acaranya. Oke teman-teman, semangat semuanya. Semoga sampai akhir lancar-lancar kita. Oke, thank you semuanya ya. Semangat. Boleh di itu, Cil. Boleh di satu-satu di admit dan share screen. Langsung aja putar video kayak openingnya tadi, Cil. Langsung.
Mungkin admit bisa di jam 7.58 gitu, Pak.
Oh, boleh. Tapi Bocil udah sih.
Sama teman-teman lain aja ya, sama panitia lain.
Oke. Nggak apa-apa.
Hello everyone, welcome to Indonesian Economic Review 6.0. Indonesian Economic Review or IER is a big event from Economic Department of Pertamina University that held every year. This year will be the 6 years of IER, and today IER 6.0 held online webinar with ASEAN scale. IER 6.0 present online webinar that held 2 days with English speaker and Bahasa speaker. The webinar has the theme ASEAN's Economic Community in 2021 Prospects and Challenges. Today's speakers: Mr. Jan Menon as Visiting Senior Fellow at Institute of Southeast ASEAN Studies. Mr. Chris Humphrey as Executive Director at EU ASEAN Business Council. Don't forget to follow this webinar until the end, and thank you for joining this event. everyone, welcome to Indonesian Economic Review 6.0. Indonesian Economic Review or IER is a big event from Economic Department of Pertamina University that held every year. This year will be the 6th year of IER, and today IER 6.0 held online webinar with ASEAN scale. IER 6.0 present online webinar that held 2 days with English speaker and Bahasa speaker. The webinar has the theme ASEAN's Economic Community in 2021 Prospect and Challenges. Today's speakers: Mr. Jan Menon as Visiting Senior Fellow at Institute of Southeast ASEAN Studies, Mr. Chris Humphrey as Executive Director at EU ASEAN Business Council. Don't forget to follow this webinar until the end, and thank you for joining this event. Welcome to Indonesian Economic Review 6.0. Indonesian Economic Review or IER is a big event from Economic Department of Pertamina University that held every year. This year will be the 6th year of IER, and today IER 6.0 held online webinar with ASEAN scale. IER 6.0 present online webinar that held 2 days with English speaker and Bahasa speaker. The webinar has the theme ASEAN's Economic Community in 2021 Prospect and Challenges. Today's speakers: Mr. Jan Menon as Visiting Senior Fellow at Institute of Southeast ASEAN Studies, Mr. Chris Humphrey as Executive Director at EU ASEAN Business Council. Don't forget to follow this webinar until the end, and thank you for joining this event. Welcome to Indonesian Economic Review 6.0. Indonesian Economic Review or IER is a big event from Economic Department of Pertamina University that held every year. This year will be the 6th year of IER, and today IER 6.0 held online webinar with ASEAN scale. IER 6.0 present online webinar that held 2 days with English speaker and Bahasa speaker. The webinar has the theme ASEAN's Economic Community in 2021 Prospect and Challenges. Today's speakers: Mr. Jan Menon as Visiting Senior Fellow at Institute of Southeast ASEAN Studies, Mr. Chris Humphrey as Executive Director at EU ASEAN Business Council. Don't forget to follow this webinar until the end, and thank you for joining this event. welcome to Indonesian Economic Review 6.0. Indonesian Economic Review or IER is a big event from Economic Department of Pertamina University that held every year. This year will be the 6 years of IER, and today IER 6.0 held online webinar with ASEAN scale. IER 6.0 present online webinar that held 2 days with English speaker and Bahasa speaker. The webinar has the theme ASEAN's Economic Community in 2021 Prospect and Challenges. Today's speakers: Mr. Jan Menon as Visiting Senior Fellow at Institute of Southeast ASEAN Studies. Mr. Chris Humphrey as Executive Director at EU-ASEAN Business Council. Don't forget to follow this webinar until the end, and thank you for joining this event. Welcome to Indonesian Economic Review 6.0. Indonesian Economic Review or IER is a big event from Economic Department of Pertamina University that held every year. This year will be the 6 years of IER, and today IER 6.0 held online webinar with ASEAN scale. IER 6.0 present online webinar that held 2 days with English speaker and Bahasa speaker. The webinar has the theme ASEAN's Economic Community in 2021 Prospect and Challenges. Today's speakers: Mr. Jan Menon as Visiting Senior Fellow at Institute of Southeast ASEAN Studies. Mr. Chris Humphrey as Executive Director at EU-ASEAN Business Council. Don't forget to follow this webinar until the end, and thank you for joining this event. Welcome to Indonesian Economic Review 6.0. Indonesian Economic Review or IER is a big event from Economic Department of Pertamina University that held every year. This year will be the 6 years of IER, and today IER 6.0 held online webinar with ASEAN scale. IER 6.0 present online webinar that held 2 days with English speaker and Bahasa speaker. The webinar has the theme ASEAN's Economic Community in 2021 Prospect and Challenges. Today's speakers: Mr. Jan Menon as Visiting Senior Fellow at Institute of Southeast ASEAN Studies. Mr. Chris Humphrey as Executive Director at EU-ASEAN Business Council. Don't forget to follow this webinar until the end, and thank you for joining this event. welcome to Indonesian Economic Review 6.0. Indonesian Economic Review or IER is a big event from Economic Department of Pertamina University that held every year. This year will be the 6 years of IER, and today IER 6.0 held online webinar with ASEAN scale. IER 6.0 present online webinar that held 2 days with English speaker and Bahasa speaker. The webinar has the theme ASEAN's Economic Community in 2021 Prospect and Challenges. Today's speakers: Mr. Jan Menon as Visiting Senior Fellow at Institute of Southeast ASEAN Studies, Mr. Chris Humphrey as Executive Director at EU ASEAN Business Council. Don't forget to follow this webinar until the end, and thank you for joining this event. Welcome to Indonesian Economic Review 6.0. Indonesian Economic Review or IER is a big event from Economic Department of Pertamina University that held every year. This year will be the 6 years of IER, and today IER 6.0 held online webinar with ASEAN scale. IER 6.0 present online webinar that held 2 days with English speaker and Bahasa speaker. The webinar has the theme ASEAN's Economic Community in 2021 Prospect and Challenges. Today's speakers: Mr. Jan Menon as Visiting Senior Fellow at Institute of Southeast ASEAN Studies, Mr. Chris Humphrey as Executive Director at EU ASEAN Business Council. Don't forget to follow this webinar until the end, and thank you for joining this event. Welcome to Indonesian Economic Review 6.0. Indonesian Economic Review or IER is a big event from Economic Department of Pertamina University that held every year. This year will be the 6 years of IER, and today IER 6.0 held online webinar with ASEAN scale. IER 6.0 present online webinar that held 2 days with English speaker and Bahasa speaker. The webinar has the theme ASEAN's Economic Community in 2021 Prospect and Challenges. Today's speakers: Mr. Jan Menon as Visiting Senior Fellow at Institute of Southeast ASEAN Studies, Mr. Chris Humphrey as Executive Director at EU ASEAN Business Council. Don't forget to follow this webinar until the end, and thank you for joining this event. welcome to Indonesian Economic Review 6.0. Indonesian Economic Review or IER is a big event from Economic Department of Pertamina University that held every year. This year will be the 6 years of IER, and today IER 6.0 held online webinar with ASEAN scale. IER 6.0 present online webinar that held 2 days with English speaker and Bahasa speaker. The webinar has the theme ASEAN's Economic Community in 2021 Prospect and Challenges. Today's speakers: Mr. Jan Menon as Visiting Senior Fellow at Institute of Southeast ASEAN Studies, Mr. Chris Humphrey as Executive Director at EU ASEAN Business Council. Don't forget to follow this webinar until the end, and thank you for joining this event. Welcome to Indonesian Economic Review 6.0. Indonesian Economic Review or IER is a big event from Economic Department of Pertamina University that held every year. This year will be the 6 years of IER, and today IER 6.0 held online webinar with ASEAN scale. IER 6.0 present online webinar that held 2 days with English speaker and Bahasa speaker. The webinar has the theme ASEAN's Economic Community in 2021 Prospect and Challenges. Today's speakers: Mr. Jan Menon as Visiting Senior Fellow at Institute of Southeast ASEAN Studies, Mr. Chris Humphrey as Executive Director at EU ASEAN Business Council. Don't forget to follow this webinar until the end, and thank you for joining this event. Welcome to Indonesian Economic Review 6.0. Indonesian Economic Review or IER is a big event from Economic Department of Pertamina University that held every year. This year will be the 6 years of IER, and today IER 6.0 held online webinar with ASEAN scale. IER 6.0 present online webinar that held 2 days with English speaker and Bahasa speaker. The webinar has the theme ASEAN's Economic Community in 2021 Prospect and Challenges. Today's speakers: Mr. Jan Menon as Visiting Senior Fellow at Institute of Southeast ASEAN Studies, Mr. Chris Humphrey as Executive Director at EU ASEAN Business Council. Don't forget to follow this webinar until the end, and thank you for joining this event. welcome to Indonesian Economic Review 6.0. Indonesian Economic Review or IER is a big event from Economic Department of Pertamina University that held every year. This year will be the 6 years of IER, and today IER 6.0 held online webinar with ASEAN scale. IER 6.0 present online webinar that held 2 days with English speaker and Bahasa speaker. The webinar has the theme ASEAN's Economic Community in 2021 Prospect and Challenges. Today's speakers: Mr. Jan Menon as Visiting Senior Fellow at Institute of Southeast ASEAN Studies, Mr. Chris Humphrey as Executive Director at EU ASEAN Business Council. Don't forget to follow this webinar until the end, and thank you for joining this event. Hello everyone, welcome to Indonesian Economic Review 6.0. Indonesian Economic Review or IER is a big event from Economic Department of Pertamina University that held every year. This year will be the 6 years of IER, and today IER 6.0 held online webinar with ASEAN scale. IER 6.0 present online webinar that held 2 days with English speaker and Bahasa speaker. The webinar has the theme ASEAN's Economic Community in 2021 Prospect and Challenges. Today's speakers: Mr. Jan Menon as Visiting Senior Fellow at Institute of Southeast ASEAN Studies, Mr. Chris Humphrey as Executive Director at EU ASEAN Business Council. Don't forget to follow this webinar until the end, and thank you for joining this event. Welcome to Indonesian Economic Review 6.0. Indonesian Economic Review or IER is a big event from Economic Department of Pertamina University that held every year. This year will be the 6 years of IER, and today IER 6.0 held online webinar with ASEAN scale. IER 6.0 present online webinar that held 2 days with English speaker and Bahasa speaker. The webinar has the theme ASEAN's Economic Community in 2021 Prospect and Challenges. Today's speakers: Mr. Jan Menon as Visiting Senior Fellow at Institute of Southeast ASEAN Studies, Mr. Chris Humphrey as Executive Director at EU ASEAN Business Council. Don't forget to follow this webinar until the end, and thank you for joining this event. welcome to Indonesian Economic Review 6.0. Indonesian Economic Review or IER is a big event from Economic Department of Pertamina University that held every year. This year will be the 6 years of IER, and today IER 6.0 held online webinar with ASEAN scale. IER 6.0 present online webinar that held 2 days with English speaker and Bahasa speaker. The webinar has the theme ASEAN's Economic Community in 2021 Prospect and Challenges. Today's speakers: Mr. Jan Menon as Visiting Senior Fellow at Institute of Southeast ASEAN Studies, Mr. Chris Humphrey as Executive Director at EU ASEAN Business Council. Don't forget to follow this webinar until the end, and thank you for joining this event. Welcome to Indonesian Economic Review 6.0. Indonesian Economic Review or IER is a big event from Economic Department of Pertamina University that held every year. This year will be the 6 years of IER, and today IER 6.0 held online webinar with ASEAN scale. IER 6.0 present online webinar that held 2 days with English speaker and Bahasa speaker. The webinar has the theme ASEAN's Economic Community in 2021 Prospect and Challenges. Today's speakers: Mr. Jan Menon as Visiting Senior Fellow at Institute of Southeast ASEAN Studies, Mr. Chris Humphrey as Executive Director at EU ASEAN Business Council. Don't forget to follow this webinar until the end, and thank you for joining this event. Welcome to Indonesian Economic Review 6.0. Indonesian Economic Review or IER is a big event from Economic Department of Pertamina University that held every year. This year will be the 6 years of IER, and today IER 6.0 held online webinar with ASEAN scale. IER 6.0 present online webinar that held 2 days with English speaker and Bahasa speaker. The webinar has the theme ASEAN's Economic Community in 2021 Prospect and Challenges. Today's speakers: Mr. Jan Menon as Visiting Senior Fellow at Institute of Southeast ASEAN Studies, Mr. Chris Humphrey as Executive Director at EU ASEAN Business Council. Don't forget to follow this webinar until the end, and thank you for joining this event. welcome to Indonesian Economic Review 6.0. Indonesian Economic Review or IER is a big event from Economic Department of Pertamina University that held every year. This year will be the 6 years of IER, and today IER 6.0 held online webinar with ASEAN scale. IER 6.0 present online webinar that held 2 days with English speaker and Bahasa speaker. The webinar has the theme ASEAN's Economic Community in 2021 Prospect and Challenges. Today's speakers: Mr. Jan Menon as Visiting Senior Fellow at Institute of Southeast ASEAN Studies, Mr. Chris Humphrey as Executive Director at EU ASEAN Business Council. Don't forget to follow this webinar until the end, and thank you for joining this event. Welcome to Indonesian Economic Review 6.0. Indonesian Economic Review or IER is a big event from Economic Department of Pertamina University that held every year. This year will be the 6 years of IER, and today IER 6.0 held online webinar with ASEAN scale. IER 6.0 present online webinar that held 2 days with English speaker and Bahasa speaker. The webinar has the theme ASEAN's Economic Community in 2021 Prospect and Challenges. Today's speakers: Mr. Jan Menon as Visiting Senior Fellow at Institute of Southeast ASEAN Studies, Mr. Chris Humphrey as Executive Director at EU ASEAN Business Council. Don't forget to follow this webinar until the end, and thank you for joining this event. Welcome to Indonesian Economic Review 6.0. Indonesian Economic Review or IER is a big event from Economic Department of Pertamina University that held every year. This year will be the 6 years of IER, and today IER 6.0 held online webinar with ASEAN scale. IER 6.0 present online webinar that held 2 days with English speaker and Bahasa speaker. The webinar has the theme ASEAN's Economic Community in 2021 Prospect and Challenges. Today's speakers: Mr. Jan Menon as Visiting Senior Fellow at Institute of Southeast ASEAN Studies, Mr. Chris Humphrey as Executive Director at EU ASEAN Business Council. Don't forget to follow this webinar until the end, and thank you for joining this event.
Biru ya, Bu?
Iya.
Dadah.
Hello everyone, welcome to Indonesian Economic Review 6.0. Indonesian Economic Review or IER is a big event from Economic Department of Pertamina University that held every year. This year will be the 6 years of IER, and today IER 6.0 held online webinar with ASEAN scale. IER 6.0 present online webinar that held 2 days with English speaker and Bahasa speaker. The webinar has the theme ASEAN's Economic Community in 2021 Prospect and Challenges. Today's speakers: Mr. Jan Menon as Visiting Senior Fellow at Institute of Southeast ASEAN Studies, Mr. Chris Humphrey as Executive Director at EU ASEAN Business Council. Don't forget to follow this webinar until the end, and thank you for joining this event. Hello everyone, welcome to Indonesian Economic Review 6.0. Indonesian Economic Review or IER is a big event from Economic Department of Pertamina University that
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the webinar Indonesian Economic Review 6.0 with the theme ASEAN Economic Community in 2021 Prospect and Challenges. First of all, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Muhammad Agung Pradana, and I will be the Master of Ceremony of webinar today. It's an honor to welcome Mr. Jan Menon, Asia Senior Visiting Fellow at Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, Mr. Chris Humphrey, Executive Director EU, ASEAN Business Council, Professor Insinyur Igusti Nyoman Wiratmaja Puja, PhD, Rector of Universitas Pertamina, and our moderator today, Ms. Audrey Chandra, as presenter at Kompas TV, and last but not least, our greatest participant. Allow me to deliver today's webinar agenda. First, opening speech by Professor Insinyur Igusti Nyoman Wiratmaja Puja, PhD, as Rector of Universitas Pertamina. Second, session introduction by Ms. Audrey Chandra. The third, webinar Indonesian Economic Review 6.0 with the theme ASEAN Economic Community in 2021 Prospect and Challenges. The fourth, discussion, question, and answer session. The fifth, announcement for the winners of paper and infographic competition. And the last, documentation and closing. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Profesor Insinyur Igusti Nyoman Wiratmadjapuja, PhD, Rector of Universitas Pertamina, to deliver his opening speech. To Professor Insinyur Igusti Nyoman Wiratmadjapuja, the green is yours.
Thank you, Mas Agung. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. May peace be upon us all. Good morning. On behalf of Pertamina University, very warm welcome to Indonesian Economic Review webinar event today. Before we get started, I would like to express my appreciation to our speaker today, Mr. Jayan Menon, the ISEAS Senior Visiting Fellow, Mr. Chris Humphrey, the Executive Director of EU ASEAN Business Council, and of course our moderator, news presenter from Kompas TV, Mrs. Audrey Chandra, and also all the academic community in Universitas Pertamina, especially the committee participant and all of the ladies and gentlemen who join us today. In this 6th Indonesian Economic Review, it takes a very interesting topic, ASEAN Economic Community in 2021, the prospect, the challenges, how to manage the future economic. I believe it will be a very hot discussion today on how ASEAN countries manage their economy under challenging situation, such as pandemic of COVID-19, uncertainty, global economy, geopolitics, which is also give many effect to the economy for each country. I wish today's seminar will provide insight, new ideas, and many benefits to all of the participants, especially for the young generation. Well, happy webinar. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Professor Igusti Nyoman Wiratmadjapuja, for the great opening speech. To all participants, I have some information. First, I want to remind you all, if you have any question, please write your question in the chat box. Later, the moderator will choose the question. Second, today, the committee has prepared a door prize for the 2 best questions and will be announced at the end of the session. And to all participants, you can make Insta story on your Instagram and tag Indonesian Economic Review Instagram, and the 3 best Insta story will be chosen and will get a door prize from the committee. So please stay till the end of this webinar. Before I hand over this event to the moderator, allow me to read a short CV from our moderator today. Mrs. Audrey Chandra, she's bachelor degree in public relations from the London School of Public Relations, Jakarta. She's professional experience are presenter at La TV at 2003 until 2005, freelance reporter at RCTI at 2012, key opinion leader for literasi digital Kominfo, now reporter, politics, law, social, and event, start from 2013 until now, and news presenter, breaking news, hard news, and soft news, start from 2015 until now. So please welcome our moderator today, Mrs. Audrey Chandra, as presenter at Kompas TV to introduce the session. Ms. Audrey Chandra, the time is yours.
Thank you, our MC today, Mr. Agung. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Salam Kebajikan. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to panel discussion Asian Economic Community in 2021, Prospect and Challenges. My name is Audrey Chandra, and I will be your moderator today. This morning, we have two speakers. The first one, please welcome Mr. Jayan Menon, Senior Visiting Fellow at Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, ICS. Good morning, Mr. Menon.
Good morning, Audrey. Nice to be with you and all your participants this morning.
Nice to meet you too, Mr. Menon. And the second one, we have Mr. Chris Humphrey, Executive Director, EU Asian Business Council. Hello, good morning, Mr. Humphrey. How are you today?
Good morning, Audrey. I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good too, thank you. Without any further ado, let's give applause our first speaker, Mr. Jayan Menon, Senior Visitor Fellow at ICS. Mr. Menon began work life as an academic in Australia, worked at several academic institutions, including in University of Melbourne, ADB Institute in Tokyo, and became board director of CDRI Cambodia. This time, Mr. Menon will talk about how Asian Economic Community have an important role in each country of ASEAN. But before that, I would like to remind ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions, please write down on chat box. If you have any question, please write down on chat box. And Mr. Menon, the time is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Audrey, and selamat siang, selamat pagi to everyone. I want to thank the organizers, University Pertamina, for having me here this morning. And I have a short presentation that I will try and start sharing right now. Please let me know if you cannot see it, but I think it should be okay. Right, yeah. So I guess today I want to talk to you about the topic that I've been given, which is the ASEAN Economic Community in 2021, prospects and challenges. But I want to speak more broadly as well, so that I don't bore you with all the details, but look at first some background in case many of you are not familiar with the history of ASEAN. I think a lot of you have heard of ASEAN and probably know it quite well, but let me go through the history and background quickly, and then talk about how I think we should assess a group like ASEAN, which I believe is quite different from most other regional cooperation agreements around the world, and especially different from the European model or the EU approach to regional integration or regionalism. And then finally, I want to say a few things about the future, where we go from here, in the context of an evolving regional and global economic architecture. And here I want to focus in on RCEP, where Indonesia and all ASEAN countries are members, and that will come into force on the 1st of January 2022. So I think it's very important to see how ASEAN fits into this architecture and how it needs to be a part of this evolution for its survival as an institution and to continue to be relevant in the future. Okay, so I'd also like to say a little bit about the pandemic, of course, that we're all interested in, and whether or not ASEAN has played a sufficient role and what more it can do. If I have time, I'll come back to that. If not, we can pick it up in the discussion. Okay, so Audrey, I think I have about 30 minutes, is that right? roughly
Right,
around
sir.
30. Yeah,
Yes.
okay. So I'll try not to take that much time so that we have more time for discussion, but let me get started. Right, okay. So I think the first point we should all recognize is that ASEAN is the longest running and most resilient grouping in the developing world. There are so many regional cooperation arrangements involving developing countries that have done nothing, actually, or very little. But ASEAN has survived more than 50 years, but more than survived, it's actually thrived. It's done, I think, extremely well, and it's evolved, starting initially as a political security pact during the Vietnam War, it came to economic integration much more recently. Initially, it was mainly focused on issues of politics and security, and it's still, these issues are still important, but the dominant focus now is on economic integration. But again, in this respect, the history is a little bit patchy. Original attempts, which was the preferential trade arrangements, did not succeed and actually were really quite unsuccessful. But when the AFTA, or ASEAN Free Trade Area proposal came up, and in 1992, then we saw a serious attempt at pursuing regional economic integration. Of course, now we have the ATIGA and the ASEAN Economic Community to focus on. So the AEC was supposed to have been concluded in 2015. It, of course, didn't meet that deadline in terms of full implementation or realization. So a successor blueprint has been developed, and now the new target is 2025, which actually is getting quite close. ASEAN, of course, has a lot of work to do. Some progress has slipped during the pandemic, of course, which is not surprising. So there will be a need to catch up if it's going to meet this new second deadline of 2025. Okay, so in assessing, these sorts of regional agreements, it's become customary to look at the European experience to serve as a benchmark. And then everything else is compared against the European case or the EU experience. And I think, the reason for that is straightforward. The EU has made great strides in economic and non-economic areas, although it's faced its own challenges. Brexit is just one example. But I think when it comes to ASEAN's performance compared to Europe, we would see that traditional measures of integration that are commonly used, things like intra-ASEAN trade flows or intra-ASEAN investment flows, these kinds of traditional metrics would suggest that ASEAN has actually failed to achieve its integration, because these measures are actually either low or stagnant or both, right? So for intra-ASEAN trade, the share has never really gone past 25%. It rose initially in the early days, but it's really never increased to anywhere near the levels in Europe, for instance, which is around 70 or so. So intra-ASEAN trade is low. The same is also true for intra-ASEAN FDI, or foreign direct investment, right? Less than 1/4 is from within the sub-region, or less than 1/4 is from ASEAN countries to other ASEAN countries, right? So these traditional indicators would suggest that ASEAN has failed. But should that be the case? Is that how we should judge ASEAN's integration? Well, I guess this depends on what the true objectives are. And in my view, ASEAN has used regionalism as a means rather than an end in itself. So the regionalism is only a pathway towards greater ends, and this, I think, needs to be recognized. ASEAN's open regionalism has served as a springboard for globalization. So the low levels of intra-ASEAN trade and investment do not spell failure, but they spell globalization. So this is the difference, I think, almost unique for ASEAN in using regionalism mostly not for integration internally, but for globalization. This is evidence when we look at the way in which ASEAN's accords have been implemented. The original ASEAN members, the ASEAN 5, if you like, have offered their accords, their preferential tariffs to both members and non-members on a non-discriminatory basis. So they multilateralized their preferences. So more than 90%, in fact, it's almost 98% at the latest count for most countries, almost all of the tariff lines have a margin of preference of 0. So what does that mean? It means the preferential tariff, the CEPT tariff for internal trade, and the MFN tariff, the external tariff for non-ASEAN members, are the same. All right. So MFN and preferential tariffs have been consolidated. And in fact, more than 70% of MFN, or 70% of intra-ASEAN trade is conducted on an MFN 0 basis. Right. So in this table, we can see a lot of the indicators in that direction. And this has actually increased since this table was put together, which is, quite a long time ago. But even in 2008, only 20% of intra-ASEAN trade was done preferentially, right? In fact, most of it even then was done on MFN basis. And again, this is because the margins of preference, as I said, the difference between the external and the internal tariff is very low. So the only exception is for agriculture in some cases, But if you see this huge red line for Thailand, even then it's only less than 5%, right? Most of the others is 1% or lower. Okay, so there's very little discrimination with ASEAN's trade, and that's a good thing. It has resulted in a low level of intra-ASEAN trade, but it's also resulted in a high level of total trade, right? So I'll come back to that in a minute, because I think that's what really matters, the total levels. So to sum up this section, I think we have to recognize that as a regionalism project, ASEAN is quite different, and certainly very different compared to Europe, right? It is outward rather than inward looking. It is market rather than government driven, and it is institution light rather than heavy. Okay, these are three key features to bear in mind when trying to understand ASEAN or in assessing ASEAN's performance, right? So the motivation itself between ASEAN and EU is very different. Okay, so ASEAN is basically a case of using regionalism for globalization. Yeah. So as I said, I think low levels of intra-ASEAN trade or investment is not the right metric to look at if you were judging ASEAN, because it's not where trade or FDI comes from that really matters, but how much of it and what form it takes, right? So of course, it's good if you can increase intra-ASEAN trade and investment naturally, and over time it has increased a little bit, and maybe there's room for it to increase some more, but we shouldn't try and force it artificially through preferences. I think that's the point to make, to bear in mind. It's not that I'm against increasing intra-ASEAN trade or investment, but when you do it through trade diversion or investment diversion, you don't serve the interests of the citizens, which is to improve their living standards. So when we measure ASEAN against its broader goal of globalization, it's actually been quite successful in my view, because the objective has been globalization rather than regionalization. Okay, so that is the ASEAN story, which I think is quite unique and quite important, and especially if you want to understand its progress, or if you want to assess it fairly, right? Okay, so now let me turn to the future and look at where we might be going from here. So ASEAN is about 55 years old. Will it survive another 50 years? In fact, do we need it to survive for another 50 years? I think we do. I think it's served its members well, and it should continue to do that. But to survive, what must it do? It has to evolve. It cannot remain stagnant. And I think its future will be defined by how it manages its role in the evolving regional architecture mainly, but also global architecture. We live in difficult times with the pandemic right now, and there's a rise in anti-globalization sentiment. Some of it is due to the pandemic, but not all. This anti-globalization push started even before the pandemic, because people, mostly in North America, but not just North America, but mostly in North America, felt that the benefits of globalization were not equally shared. So we've seen, very sharp increases in inequality and concerns that globalization has led to an export of jobs from the developed to the developing countries. So this has increased anti-globalization sentiments in the West, but it's also spread like the virus and with the virus throughout the region. And today, we have raised a lot of barriers to factor movements, labor in particular, but also talk of capital reshoring, which I hope will not last long after the pandemic is behind us. They are there now in the name of the pandemic for safety and all that, but will they remain after we are finally over this pandemic, whenever that is? That's my fear, that it might remain longer than it needs to be. And we need regional agreements like RCEP to help us ensure that we remove those barriers when the need for them has disappeared, and lock in the benefits or lock in the reforms that we've already achieved, that have been hard won on trade and investment during difficult times. ASEAN has played that role, I think, quite well. And going forward, it has to do that within the broader regional context of RCEP, APEC, WTO, and so on. We have a WTO ministerial starting in a few days in Geneva, 30th of November. And so hopefully we will see more support for a rules-based multilateral trading system. But let me now talk a bit more about RCEP, because I think that is the critical regional agreement for ASEAN countries as they go forward. So ASEAN's future now is closely tied to RCEP and how that evolves. Of course, ASEAN members are also members of other agreements like the CPTPP, APEC, and they are all members of WTO. And they all have various bilateral agreements as well. But I think RCEP will be an anchor, especially for global supply chains that are so important to members of ASEAN. Right. So, but there is a fear that RCEP is China-driven and not ASEAN-driven. And this is a worry that the centrality of ASEAN might be diminished, and that this is just lip service. There's all this talk about centrality, that it's really China driving RCEP. The joke about that is that if China was the one really driving RCEP, it wouldn't have taken so long to conclude. It would have happened a lot sooner. But I think we have to recognize that while China might be the biggest winner in absolute terms because of its size, everyone can stand to gain from RCEP because of the global value chains or supply chains, right? And the interdependence that it implies between countries, right? So this is going to lift all countries, the linkages created by regional supply chains. And of course, the benefits will not be equal, but they will be mutual, right? And that's the important thing about liberalizing trade and about agreements like RCEP, that there are mutual benefits to all members, even if those benefits are not equally distributed. But actually, I think the biggest winners in percentage terms, and that's what really matters, right? Not absolute, but percentage relative to the size of your economy, will be the newest members of ASEAN, right? Not China. In fact, I think in percentage terms, even the original members of ASEAN will gain more than China or Japan or Korea. So, or Australia or New Zealand. But the newest members have the most to gain because they have the most to change. This is where reform has a long way to go still in these newest members of ASEAN in the Mekong region. But of course, all of this depends on how it's implemented. And therein lies the greatest challenge, in my view. Implementation will be the key, especially in an agreement which will rely heavily on goodwill, right? It's not the ASEAN way to run to court every time someone doesn't comply with a particular aspect of the agreement. That's not how it's done, and I think it will continue with RCEP. There's no investor state dispute settlement mechanism, ISDS, and so implementation will depend on countries seeing it in their own interests to implement the reforms. Countries must be convinced that this is good for them, and they have to, and that message, I think, needs to be sold to these countries, why it's in their interest to actually implement a lot of the RCEP reforms, like with the ASEAN Economic Community before. And I think a successful RCEP will also benefit the world as a whole. But for ASEAN countries, RCEP will serve its interests best if it remains both open and outward looking, right? By open, I mean admitting new members over time in a very transparent manner and not requiring too much in terms of too much of a burden, basically, to join up. Not too much more than the original members went through, at least. And so that's going to be important, right? It has to keep growing. In fact, even maybe merging with other agreements, the CPTPP, or even something broader around APEC. So it must keep growing, and it must keep looking outwards, just like ASEAN did, by multilateralizing its accords, by always keeping globalization in mind when it comes to implementing the agreement. It must try and avoid splintering because, as I said, ASEAN countries are members of multiple agreements. So we don't want breakaway groups, taking playing a dominant role. It has to keep it together, keep its membership together as it moves forward. ASEAN could never really turn inward like Europe because it was too small. It didn't have the critical mass. It couldn't self-sustain, right? It had to keep the doors open. But RCEP is bigger than Europe, right? It's a third of the world's economy and population. And so it could technically afford to turn inward and sustain itself, but it won't be serving its members' interests by doing that. So it can, but it shouldn't. And I hope that the open regionalism of ASEAN will continue with RCEP going forward. Yeah. And the most important reason for that is to support the growth and spread of global supply chains that are critical to the ASEAN countries especially. But RCEP brings all the members of the regional chain together in one agreement, right? All the main players in the regional supply chain are members of RCEP, and it's looking at creating a single rule of origin and promoting regulatory convergence and trying to simplify and to overcome the contradictions in these multiple agreements that their members currently have. So if we can go somewhere towards simplifying and harmonizing these multiple accords, consolidating them, this will actually help businesses, especially small and medium-sized businesses, use these agreements more easily and efficiently. So that's what I think RCEP has the potential to do. We hope that that potential will be turned into a reality very soon. But there are, a lot of sort of clouds on the horizon that we have to be wary of. And one of the main big clouds is the US-China trade war. And this is, I think, the biggest challenge. In fact, much more than the pandemic itself. The pandemic will not derail the growth of these ASEAN countries, in my view. The Delta variant or the next variant, they're talking about the new South African variant now, or any other variant, I think, will not derail recovery. We've gone through that now because the response from governments is a lot more tempered nowadays. The original response was mainly driven out of fear because we had no data, but now we know a lot more about how the virus spreads. So I think we won't see the return to the prolonged lockdowns going forward. So the main threat now is escalation, the US-China trade war. And we often hear that, ASEAN countries should not pick sides. I think that's true, but, whether that's possible, if this continues, is a different question. But I hope they don't have to pick sides. And of course, if we can resolve the trade war, they won't need to pick sides. Some ASEAN countries are actually benefiting in the short run from this trade war by, investments coming out of China into the region. But this is a short run thing, right? Vietnam, Thailand, maybe Malaysia, and maybe even Indonesia, Philippines have gained a bit more in FDI because of this trade war and relocation. But, this is not going to be the way forward, relying on, investments diverting away from China because of the trade war. They're moving out of China because wages are rising in China, but that's okay. But I think in the long run, resolution of this trade war will serve the interests of ASEAN, of the combatants, the US and China, and the world. And hopefully RCEP can play a small role. We have to be realistic. It's not going to be the main reason the trade war ends, but maybe it can play a small role, or at least in sort of ensuring that the impacts are contained and doesn't escalate. We don't want ASEAN or RCEP members buying into a tit for tat increase in protectionism as this trade war escalates. Right. So that's the big challenge I see actually on the horizon, is dealing with this US-China trade war. I think again this WTO ministerial starting soon will be important in dealing with the future of a rules-based multilateral trading system. There's a lot of things that the ministerial has on its agenda, from fishery subsidies to pandemic response to digital trade. But I think an important underlying dimension of this meeting coming up is how the developing South is represented fairly at these sorts of global summits. The world has changed since these institutions were first conceived, right? And China was not a big player. ASEAN was not that important either, as was India then. But today, the institutions need to recognize that the South wants to be part of the deal-making process in a very direct way and should be given that opportunity, or we will see a breakdown in these sorts of multilateral mechanisms. So ASEAN, I think, must be better represented, as must India, China, South Africa, the BRICS, and other countries. And this might play out, the North-South divide, at this WTO ministerial. And hopefully it won't lead to further marginalization, but by confronting these issues, we will find a better way of working together, recognizing the changes in the geopolitics of the world, and ensuring that, by being more inclusive, these types of important multilateral organizations can work effectively. ASEAN has worked very well, in my view, and has lessons for other developing member countries or groupings, but hopefully it will also mean that its interests will be better represented at global forums. So I think I've gone exactly 30 minutes according to my count, so maybe a little bit more. So let me stop there and thank you for your attention and listening. And let me now turn it back to you, Audrey. And I look forward to any questions that you might have. So thank you very much. Terima kasih.
Thank you. Yeah, terima kasih. Thank you very much, Mr. Menon, Senior Visiting Fellow at ICS, give us information and presentation about Asian regionalism and future. Ladies and gentlemen, don't go anywhere, because after this, we will meet Executive Director EU Asian Business Council, Mr. Chris Humphrey. But before that, let's take a look at the performance of Pertamina University.
Sunday morning rain is falling. Still some cover shared some skin.
Clouds are shrouding us in moments unforgettable. You twist to fit the mold that I'm in. But things just get so crazy, living life gets hard to do. And I would gladly hit the road, get up and go if I knew that someday it will lead me back to you.
That someday it will lead me back to you. That may be all I need. In darkness she is all I see.
Well, come and rest your bones with me. Drive slow on Sunday morning, and I never want to leave. Fingers trace your every outline. Paint a picture with my hand. And back and forth to sway like branches in a storm. Change the weather, still together when it ends. That may be all I need. In darkness she is all I see. Come and rest your bones
slow on Sunday morning, and I never want to leave. Oh yeah, but things just get so crazy. Living life gets hard to do. Sunday morning rain is falling, and I'm calling out to you, singing someday it will lead me back to you. Find a way to get myself back home to you. That may be all I need. In darkness she is all I see. Come and rest your bones with me.
Driving slow on Sunday morning, and I never want to leave.
Okay, hello, still with me, Audrey Chandra, and I would like to thank you for more than 200 participants still with us. And now in this session, we will hear about the impact of implementing Asian Economic Community of the interest of European business operating in ASEAN. Please welcome Mr. Chris Humphrey, Executive Director, EU Asian Business Council. Mr. Humphrey is a business development and government relations professional with more than a decade of experience running business units throughout Asia and over 20 years of experience of either working or dealing with the governments and regulatory authorities. I would like to remind ladies and gentlemen, if you have any question, please write down on chat box, and Mr. Humphrey, the green is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here this morning. Giant's always a tough act to follow. If I can share my screen, I will do some a presentation for you as well. I think I'll be reinforcing many of the points that Giant just made. I will take a slightly different tact on some of them as well. Again, I'm going to talk about the AEC. I will talk about it from the viewpoint of European industry in the region, about where we think it is and where it is going in the future as well, and talk about towards the end some of the challenges that it's facing, both in the immediate term and then in the near and medium term as well. I think the first thing is, what is the AEC? And that's an important starting point for this discussion today. The original blueprint, the headline statement was to make ASEAN a single market and production base. And I think in that respect, it really was a regionalism project. It's about bringing ASEAN countries closer together. It was about boosting intra-ASEAN trade, partly to create a more resilient region against external impacts that it may be facing going forward. But that regionalism, I think, as Janet just said, also had a global context in it. It was making ASEAN more relevant to the global economy and making ASEAN a place that would attract more investment from the global economy, and plugging regional value chains from ASEAN into global value chains as well. As Janet said, the 2015 project, it did not achieve its full aims. They did then come up with the AEC Blueprint 2025 and a somewhat watered down headline ambition of creating a deeply integrated and highly cohesive ASEAN economy, which is remarkably different, I think, from a single market and production base that is perhaps wedded more in reality for the region. I would contend that the AEC will not be complete by 2025, and indeed they are already working on a blueprint through to 2035 as well. It will look slightly different. I don't think the overall ambition of deeply integrated and highly cohesive can be watered down any further if they want to remain credible. What I would say about the AEC is, when I first came into this role almost 8 years ago, and the first time I picked up the AEC blueprint, the original one, I thought what they were trying to achieve was extremely ambitious, maybe too ambitious is my view. But they were trying to do it in that institutional light way that Giant just mentioned as well. And I think if they do get close, and they have been making progress, to be fair, if they do get close to the ultimate ambitions contained in those two blueprints and deliver on all those objectives, they'd have done something which I think is unparalleled in human history. The AEC, this is a slide I've not used for a very long time, but I will use it now because essentially there were 5 key building blocks for the AEC itself. The idea is that it would eventually achieve a free flow of goods, a free flow of investment, free trading services, that free flow of skilled labor, and the freer flow of capital. That was the original aim. Those aims still exist in the new blueprint, although slightly amended. All this to be done through a range of different ASEAN agreements, like a TIGA, as the ASEAN Trades in Goods Agreement, and other ones as well, all of which would lead you to that single market production base, eventually 10 growing economies, 650 million plus people, the world's 5th, by some measures soon to be the 4th largest economy. All very, very commendable. And ASEAN itself, I think, has never been short on ideas. I think that's been part of the problem for it, maybe too many ideas. There are an absolute plethora of different blueprints, agreements, framework agreements, master plans, action plans, implementation plans, etc. And we're just getting a few of them on the screen now coming up. And if anything, ASEAN is perhaps trying to do too much at the same time, which means some of the key issues that it needs to be looking at for its own internal issues and to make itself continue to be relevant in the global context are perhaps getting left behind. You have to remember that for all of these things you see on your screen, and I could have probably doubled the number of words on that screen at the moment and still would not have covered all the things that they are meant to be working on. A lot of it is being done by the same officials. It's the same officials who regularly turn up to all the ASEAN meetings. And these guys also have day jobs to do at the same time within their domestic authorities. So looking at ASEAN, what's the perception of delivery? Because it's not short on ideas. Every year we do a sentiment survey of European industries, businesses working in the ASEAN region. And this year's results virtually were not that remarkably different from previous years as well. Is ASEAN regional integration under the AEC progressing fast enough? I think you can see here that it's a resounding no. Only 2% of respondents said yes, it is. Bigger number than ever before saying no, it isn't. And I think that is a concern for the region. Now, there are maybe some reasons for that. Clearly, COVID-19 has not helped. It's detracted governments away from regional projects while they look at sorting out domestic issues. Has it achieved its objectives of that highly integrated, cohesive economy, or indeed of the original one, the single market and production place? Again, only 6% of our respondents were saying yes to that. And I think that is very, very telling. There is no point in undertaking a project like this, a very ambitious project like this, if the people you're meant to be benefiting, which is industry, and therefore citizens of the region, are not feeling the benefit of it. Some other news from my headline, from my survey, and there is good news for the region. 63% of the respondents said they're going to increase their profits. The same number, and this is the highest it's ever been, ranked ASEAN as the region of best economic opportunity over the next 5 years. And the gap between ASEAN and the next highest rank, which was China, has widened as well. And I think that is good news. I mean, ASEAN is seen for what it is. It's a region of incredible opportunity and potential. And 82% said they're going to increase the level of investment in the region over the next 5 years. So I think if you're sitting inside a Ministry of Finance or a Ministry of Trade or Commerce in the region, you'll look at those numbers and think, great, this is fantastic news for us. And indeed, it is good news. But there is clearly room for improvement. And I showed you those two stats just now on the previous charts. Basically, European industry does not believe the AEC is progressing fast enough and is not achieving its aims. Of more concern, I think, are that 81% say there are too many barriers to the efficient use of supply chains in the region. I mean, if you think one of the prime reasons for the AEC was to increase supply chain efficiency and make ASEAN more relevant to global value chains, that has to be a major concern. And only 3% think that non-tariff barriers are decreasing. A key ambition set out in the original blueprint and repeated in the 2025 blueprint was non-tariff barrier elimination. And I will point out in a moment, I do not believe that is going anywhere fast. And what is the problem with NTBs? As I said, only 3% think they're decreasing. Actually, a higher number than ever before. think they're actually increasing. The situation is getting worse as opposed to remaining about the same. And I think that's a major problem for the region. A few statements here from some key ASEAN documents talking about how they're going to work towards eliminating them. I could have filled this slide up with quotes from various ASEAN leaders' statements or ASEAN economic ministerial statements, or indeed other documents saying that we are tackling it, we are doing things, we are putting measures in place, we are very serious about it. But I'm afraid I don't see a huge amount of action coming through the region on NTBs. It was interesting actually hearing Giant talking about RCEP and how that may help with regulatory alignment in the region. One of the biggest problems I see in ASEAN is the lack of harmonization of standards, which unfortunately just means that the NTBs get worse and not better. And talking about RCEP as he was just now, I think RCEP is a brilliant agreement. It's a huge kudos to ASEAN for getting it over the line. But I understand that the negotiations behind the scenes almost broke ASEAN. So I think in that respect, it is a remarkable achievement to have got it done. NTMs and MTBs, I mean, NTMs, non-tariff measures, are not a bad thing. I always say when I'm presenting to people, an increase in the number of non-tariff measures often represents regulatory maturity. You've got to remember a lot of the ASEAN member states, especially outside the original ASEAN 5, are playing a lot of catch up. They need to put in place more rules and regulations, if only to protect public health and safety. So an increased NTMs is not to be unexpected. The concern is when those NTMs become actual barriers to trade. And you'll see on the chart at the bottom, the table at the bottom, price control measures, quantity control measures, they are very often actually an NTB. Governments putting in place controls on prices and restricting imports into markets actually stifles innovation, protects certain industries from competition, and that's all to the detriment of the consumer at the end of the day. It was a #1 priority for Brunei for this year, was tackling NTMs. They did come up with a thing called the NTM Toolkit, which was designed specifically for ASEAN with the support of IER, to help them identify which non-tariff measures actually were in fact barriers. Unfortunately, whilst they've agreed to it, and that was a struggle, using that NTM Toolkit is neither compulsory and nor is reporting on it compulsory, which rather suggests it'll be another tool that ASEAN has in its basket of tools, which will just sit there gathering dust. Giant mentioned trade figures, and he was arguing that intra-ASEAN trade should not be the only measure of AEC success. I would partially agree with him on that, but when you think about it, the prime reason for the AEC and the prime reason for the ASEAN Trades in Goods Agreement actually was to boost intra-ASEAN trade, to get the 10 member states trading more with each other, to make themselves stronger and to insulate themselves more from global shocks at the same time. My chart here, which is very similar to the one that Giant just showed, in fact, shows ASEAN trading goods. The green line is the share of intra-ASEAN trade, and as you can see, it has been falling, even though all the measures that they're putting in place should be seen that line going the other way. ASEAN, in terms of trading with itself, is actually very much underperforming. If you looked at the old NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, now the US, Mexico, Canada agreement, trade amongst those three, intra-regional trade amongst those three is around 40%. In Europe, which I know is a very different animal, it truly is a single market, but in Europe, intra-EU trade accounts for around about 65% of all EU trade. ASEAN, I don't think will ever get to those levels, but it should be looking to boost its intra-regional trade. And indeed, back in 2017, the economic ministers and the leaders set a target, which was to double intra-ASEAN trade by 2025. And on this chart here, that the blue line shows the trajectory that ASEAN trade, intra-ASEAN trade, needs to go on to achieve that. The orange line is the prediction of where they're currently going based on existing trends in the region. So they're going to miss that target by a long way. And in fact, here you can see growth in intra-ASEAN trade, and 2014 to 2016, intra-ASEAN trade fell. It did come back a bit in 2017 and 2018, but it was falling in 2019. And of course, last year with the pandemic and with border closures and everything, all the other problems we faced, it fell further again. I think ASEAN will miss that target. There's no doubt that ASEAN will miss that target. There have been successes. I will not deny that. Tariff elimination, as Janet mentioned, actually has been a huge success in the region. So for much of the trade within ASEAN, as long as you are qualifying, so in other words, as long as you have the right certificate of origin in place, you can prove your ASEAN content is 40% or more, you are moving goods around the region at 0 tariff rates for the main part. There's just very, very few tariff lines left. They have put in place the self-certification program. This means that traders, shippers, manufacturers now don't need to go and prove things. They can self-certify that they are meeting the criteria for that tariff elimination. We have the ASEAN single window in place. This is a linking up of national single windows for customs authorities. It makes life easier for traders. It's only exchanging a few documents at the moment, but there are plans to expand it. There's the ASEAN Customs Transit System, which actually was funded by the European Union through its Arise Plus project. And this means that land movements of goods are much easier and simpler. It removes paperwork issues. It removes, in theory at least, the need to change trucks and drivers at borders. So you could now load a lorry in Singapore and drive it all the way to Vietnam without having to worry about additional customs checks. And there has been progress on harmonization standards, but it is very, very limited. Cosmetics is one area where they harmonize standards. There's been some progress in others, a little bit of progress on the automotive side of life, but a lot of the work is lagging, is slow, it is difficult, and a lot of it, I'm afraid, is governed by mutual recognition agreements, which means that the integration is not really happening. So more work is needed. Definitely more work is needed on non-tariff barriers to trade. They are a real block to intra-ASEAN trade. They're a block to innovation. They're a block to competition, and they're holding the region back. On the harmonization of standards, the work that ASEAN is doing, the groups that look after it probably don't meet frequently enough. It has been hampered by COVID-19, of course, where physical meetings can't take place. Negotiating these things over Zoom calls is not the easiest way of going about business, but they do need to move faster on this. If they want to be seen as a single block which can attract more investment, they need to be sorting out the standards amongst themselves. More work is needed on customs automation. I should say actually on this, I think the customs authorities in the region have over the last couple of years made great strides in automating their systems. Some advancing better than others. The problems that my members tell me about with customs are certainly getting less or easier to navigate through. And there are plans, as I said, to expand the ASEAN single window so that it's not just the Form D, which is the certificate of origin to qualify for tariff elimination, that is being exchanged. They are looking at exchanging e-photo certificates and health declarations and licenses and permits as well, which will make life a lot easier, particularly for smaller traders in the region. ASEAN Trade Repository, for those of you who want to know what that is linking together national trade repositories, and they are meant to be online searchable systems to allow businesses to understand and find rules and regulations that govern the products that they're making and the services that they're providing. It is horribly behind schedule. Under the ASEAN Trading Goods Agreement, it should be in place already. It might be in place by the end of next year as a fully completed system. And the full implementation of ATIGA. ATIGA is 11 years old this year. It is the prime governing agreement for goods movements within ASEAN under the AEC, and it is not fully implemented. You heard Giant mention earlier that ASEAN member states don't really like taking each other to court. Well, they don't take each other to court at all, even though there are clear breaches of ATIGA going on all the time in the region, and large elements of it really aren't implemented. But despite that, they are currently doing a midterm review, if you like, at the moment. They are looking at upgrading ATIGA, trying to improve it, and it does need improving, and it needs bringing into the modern day. At the moment, it doesn't cover things like e-commerce or intellectual property rights, for instance. So where are we today with the AEC? I would contend that there is no free flow of goods in the region. There is certainly no free flow of investment. There is no free trade in services. There is no free trade in skilled labor, and I don't think there ever will be free movement of skilled labor in the region. And there's no freer flow of capital as well. They are heading in the right direction. They are making progress, but it is painfully slow at times. And I think the private sector, not just European industry, but ASEAN industry and others as well, are losing some patience with it. And I think the whole point of the AEC was to try and make ASEAN more relevant globally. I'd agree with Giant on that, but it's also about promoting itself internally as well. And we asked this question again in our survey: are there too many barriers to the efficient use of supply chains? And barriers in this respect aren't just non-tariff barriers to trade. They are things like customs procedures as well, and indeed infrastructural issues. And the answer overwhelmingly is yes, there are too many barriers to the efficient use of supply chains within ASEAN. And that is critically important, I think, when you're looking at ASEAN as a region and trying to make itself more applicable to the global economy. More importantly, if those barriers were removed, would you increase your use of regional supply chains? And the answer again was an overwhelming yes, we would increase our use of regional supply chains. In other words, we would look to do more things in ASEAN. We would look to source more products from ASEAN. We would look to make more investments in ASEAN. If only ASEAN could sort out those barriers amongst itself. That said, I would agree with what the Giant said. I think the prospects for ASEAN going forward are enormous, and they're enormous simply because of all the issues, that the numbers, the facts you see on your screen here. It is a huge region. It is a region which, if they were acting collectively as one and were truly a single market, could be rivaling China and India as future centers of growth for the global economy. It has the world's third largest workforce. The levels of urbanization are astonishing in the region. I think something like 3 times the size of the population of Malaysia will be moving into urban centers over the next 10 to 15 years. And that's a massive number. Middle class is growing as well. So if you're the manufacturer of things like TVs or refrigerators or cars or motorbikes or any sort of aspirational good, this is a region you want to be looking at. The digital economy is booming in ASEAN. We all know that. People here are very tech savvy. We've all got used, not just because of COVID-19, but even before that, to doing things online, to shopping online, to exchanging information online. And it's another reason, I think, why we should be looking more and more at this region. So there's lots and lots of positives for ASEAN going forward. And it's a reason why businesses still come here. It's a reason why European industry is saying they want to increase their investments in ASEAN. But these are the reasons that you see on your screen now. The reasons are not the AEC. The challenges going forward, well, they're the here and now ones. They need to accelerate economic recovery coming out of COVID-19. I would contend actually that ASEAN's had a very bad COVID-19 as a grouping. They really did act as 10 individuals. They're only now beginning to think about how we could do things better going forward as a group of 10. They need to boost trade and investment. It was interesting seeing a Giant slide looking at intra-ASEAN FDI. Actually, there's a lot of double counting for intra-ASEAN FDI. So European money lands in Singapore, then moves from Singapore to Indonesia. That second movement is encountered as intra-ASEAN FDI, but the original funds are coming from overseas. I could have showed you charts about FDI coming into ASEAN from its dialogue partners. It's a very bumpy picture. And I think the trend, unfortunately, is slightly down over the last 5 years rather than increasing, which is what you should expect it to be doing. So there is that need to improve ASEAN's attractiveness. I do think things like RCEP and some of the ASEAN member states being in CPTPP will improve its attractiveness. We need to see how RCEP delivers when it comes to be implemented early next year, how it's going to be implemented as well. Certainly, the ASEAN member states collectively and individually do believe in that rules-based multilateral trading system that Giant mentioned, and that does hold them in some good stead compared to others in the world. They need, I think, coming out of COVID-19 to develop a coherent ASEAN-wide reopening plan. We are seeing at the moment some bilateral reopening, Singapore, Malaysia recently having their vaccinated travel lanes, but there needs to be more of a regional approach to this. It's something that industry wants. I mean, Most of the movements in and out of ASEAN countries were actually intra-ASEAN movements. It is holding back trade, it is holding back investment, it is holding back economic activity. In the near to medium term, well, the world is moving ahead fast. It's moving ahead fast on digital issues, it's moving ahead fast on environmental issues and climate change issues, and ASEAN needs to be moving in pace with the rest of the world. Sustainability in all its senses, and I often say this to my friends back in Europe, sustainability is not just about the environment. For people in this part of the world, it is more basic things like putting food on the table and having access to education and access to healthcare and access to clean water, as well as looking after the environment. And I think these are areas which ASEAN needs to work on and be seen to be working on faster and moving quicker on economic development through the AEC and through its external relations can actually help with that. Greening of supply chains will become increasingly important, particularly for future FDI, not just from Europe, but also from the US, from Japan, and from Canada and other places as well. Because European industry in particular will not be able to make investments soon in places where their supply chains can't be seen to be green. And that means moving faster on things like energy transition, dealing with climate change issues, dealing with labor right issues as well. I'm afraid this is a fact of the world. And the reason why they won't be able to make the investment is not just legislation back in their home countries, it's pressure from NGOs, it's pressure from their institutional investors, and it's pressure from their shareholders. And in the biggest pressure of all is perhaps from their own consumers. Climate change issues need to be dealt with. COP26 showed some great progress. It was very good to see countries like Vietnam committing to removing coal-fired power stations to set deadlines. Disappointing that Indonesia backtracked on some of its deforestation issues. But it's an area that the region needs to work on. It is very susceptible, I'm afraid, to natural disasters, and those natural disasters are going to get worse unless we all start tackling climate change issues. And future skills, absolutely. Digital economy is here, it's going to get bigger. We need to be training our people, our young people, to be more flexible, to be more entrepreneurial, to be more innovative going forward. What you're seeing on your slide now are recommendations actually that the Business Council made to the ASEAN economic ministers earlier this year when we met them. There are 10 there, if you count them, because number 1 is divided into 4 different areas. I won't read them all out to you, but the ones on accelerating the work on the AEC I think are absolutely important if ASEAN is to make the best of the opportunity that it has before it and to accelerate economic development for the benefit of everyone and to help with the sustainability issues that I just mentioned. I think number 4 is extremely important as well, moving forward in energy transition to allow the region to be cleaner and greener, which in itself I hope to attract more FDI from overseas, doesn't matter where it's coming from, is of vital importance. Some of them take it more seriously than others. I think there's an absolute need to do more work in this sort of area. And also then looking at the digital economy issues as well, you look at number 6, having some ASEAN-wide rules on data governance and cross-border flows, which do not allow for the opt-outs that exist in the current agreements. I think is also absolutely vital for them. So I think my conclusion, how can we keep ASEAN relevant going forward? Well, I think the way actually is really for it to boost ASEAN centrality, which is a very important concept for the region. It's not often understood very well by those outside the region, but ASEAN needs to boost ASEAN centrality. And to do that, it needs to work as one, and more importantly, to be seen to be working as one, rather than as 10 separate entities. And unfortunately, I think some of the basic problems that ASEAN faces is the 10 member states often see themselves in competition with each other, particularly when it comes to attracting FDI and boosting trade issues. So our 10 recommendations you saw on the previous slide, as we like to say at the Council, is to ensure the power of 10 applies, not merely the sum of 10. For the math students, you all know that the power of 10 is much more than the sum of 10. And that, I think, is ASEAN's basic problem at the moment. They have great ideas. They have brilliant objectives they're trying to achieve. They are trying to achieve something which, in some respects, may be impossible to achieve. They shouldn't try to do it. And if you are going to do it, though, you need to be working faster and harder on it and working as 10, because if you do work as 10 together and remove that internal competition from each other, you stand a chance of achieving something of a major success in the world. And any questions now? Happy to take them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Humphrey, Executive Director, EU Asian Business Council, for your insight and presentation about Asian Economic Community today. Now we enter Q&A session. I will read the questions from the audience. We have many questions. I would like to read first from, wait. Okay, the first one, wait, because we have many questions. Wait a minute. Okay. Okay, the first one, the question from Mr. Kelvin Risky from Pertamina or University of Pertamina. The question to Mr. Menon. If we talk about RCEP, I have a skeptical view that this cooperation is only dominated by China, and in the end, China will dominate the economic structure of Asian countries, and Asian countries have a high dependence on China. The question is, what do you think about this, and how do you think countries in Asia, especially like Indonesia, should respond to this condition? Please, Mr. Menon.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for starting off with a very sensitive and difficult question. I'll see if I can try and address this. Yes, so I think this is a a common, perhaps even legitimate question and concern. I think you heard my views. I don't think China will dominate in the sense anymore. I mean, China is already dominant in the region, right? And its influence is growing. The question is, will RCEP change that, increase that in a dramatic way? I don't think so. Yeah. In fact, I think RCEP sets the framework for China to play according to a set of, common rules. The jury is out on that. We'll have to see whether RCEP makes a real difference when it comes to the implementation of its accords. But I think it has the potential to keep China playing the game according to a common set of rules. And I think also that, we need to separate the geopolitics from the economics to some extent. Of course, they're related, but, the geopolitical issues are there and they're being addressed using a lot of economic instruments, which I think is the wrong way to go about it. Maybe we can, even that up a little bit through common membership of these sorts of agreements, and try and keep, as far as we can, the economic policy aspects separately from the security and the geopolitics as much as we can. I mean, they're not separate; they're interlinked. But I think we need to try and keep them as separate as possible. And these types of agreements can provide a vehicle for doing that. Yeah. So bottom line is, I don't think the dominance will necessarily increase because of RCEP. It might increase for other reasons. But China is already big. We are all linked together. We can't move China out of the supply chain, and nor should we try and do that. I think that's not in our interest. It's not actually in the interest of the US either, and I hope they realize that soon. But RCEP won't change things very much in and of itself, in my view. Let me stop there, Audrey.
Okay, maybe in another words, we have to hand in hand to work together, yeah, Mr. Menon?
And maybe, yes, that's right, that we should work together. I think maybe Chris also from the business side might have some interesting thoughts on this issue. I don't want to usurp your role as the moderator, but
yeah.
I would say on RCEP, I think it's often seen from a political point of view to be China-led. I don't actually agree with that. I think it was ASEAN-led. It was ASEAN trying to make its own +1 FTAs more relevant, more important. It was hugely ambitious. As I mentioned in my comments, I think the negotiations almost broke ASEAN, trying to get their own line agreed internally before they sat down with the RCEP partners. It's a huge shame that India pulled out of it, but I think India remaining and trying to accommodate them would have weakened RCEP considerably. It is a very, very good agreement. Yes, some of the tariff elimination schedules in it could be accelerated faster. One of the key things actually is that unified approach on rules of origin going forward. And I think it's an agreement which will stand the test of time and will develop, and it does make ASEAN more relevant globally. And one of the big achievements actually with RCEP is that it brings China, Japan and Korea into an agreement for the first time. And that in itself is quite remarkable. So I think from a business point of view, it's very, very much a welcome agreement. It is, and I don't think it should be viewed as an anti-US move by anybody. I don't agree with that. This is very much just pure economics behind it.
Okay, thank you for the answer. And move on to the next question from France GA English to Mr. Humphrey. There are two questions. The first one, Asian countries has regulations. What are the main barriers for European countries when doing investment projects? Otherwise, China can easily does joint venture with Asian. The first question, maybe you can answer first, Mr. Humphrey.
Sure. I think there are two problems. Okay, the first problem is market access issues, and some countries in the region, like where you're currently sitting, having import substitution rules as well, and requiring local content, which scares some firms off. Having rules around increased local content are fine if your own domestic supply chains have both the quantity and the quality of goods to put into products, and that's not always the case, unfortunately. There are, in much of the region, things like negative investment lists, which reduce the amount of share ownership that foreign entities can have in local entities, and they are a big, big problem. And then, of course, from the European point of view, you know, European headquartered firms are bound by European legislation, and some of that is pretty tough. And it's only going to get tougher in respect of things like greening supply chains, like I mentioned during my presentation just now. And that will not help life. And if ASEAN wants to continue to attract investments from places like Europe, they're going to need to start cleaning their act up in some of those areas. So I think that is also a concern. On the political side of life, I mean, Europe is a huge player with ASEAN. It provides huge amounts of support behind the scenes for economic integration, on security issues, on social cultural issues as well. What Europe does not do is provide money for concrete. You won't go around the region and find airports with a plaque on the outside saying built with money from the European Union, but you will find them with plaques on the outside saying built with money from China or from Japan or from Korea. And when they're doing those sorts of support aid work, if you like, of course, the primary contractors are always from their home country as well, which is why you see a lot of what looks like a lot of Chinese investment in the region. So a lot of the European investment has been much longer term, and a lot of the investment from European institutions is much more behind the scenes in terms of capacity building.
Okay, my next question is, what is the political strategy we can learn from China, we can learn from Korea and Japan, Mr. Humphrey?
Well, I think I just alluded that in my last answer. It's very different approach. Europe's is a much more of a soft approach. It's about capacity building, it's behind the scenes aid and support, it's advice, it's working with countries to teach them how to best develop rules and regulations, to capacity build for civil servants, educational issues.
Capacity building, including we as a human, the society?
Yes, yes, it's humans and it's society. Whereas a lot of the involvement, particularly from North Asia, is much more in terms of concrete and steel. It's building a hospital, it's building an airport, it's building a railway. I remember once sitting down with one of the smaller ASEAN member states with their transport minister, and he was complaining that Europe wasn't going to invest and build a high-speed railway line for them, but China was willing to do it. And I did say to him, well, you do realize that when they do it for you, the prime contractors will be from China, they won't be from your country, And at the end of the day, you've still got the bill to pay because they're going to want their money back at some point.
Okay, the next question, still from French GA English. The question is, EU or Western demanded Asian countries must do elimination of non-tariff barriers to trade, but Asian countries thinks all their crude exports, such as palm oil, has been stuck because of the issue of forestry. Mr. Humphrey, what do you think to accelerate the investment if the risk-sensitive issues cannot be avoided, but both are really demanding each other?
Okay, there are certainly some irritants in the relationship. The palm oil one was an irritant. One thing I would say on palm oil, exports of palm oil from Indonesia and Malaysia to the EU have gone up over the last few years. They have not gone down, and there was no ban on palm oil exports from this part of the world to the EU. It was badly communicated, perhaps by Europe. It was certainly misrepresented at this end. There was the RED II directive, which is purely around biofuels and using biofuels that hit certain emission targets, and also related to indirect land use issues as well. Both countries, of course, taken the EU to WTO on that. My personal view is they would win at WTO on RED II, but it was not a ban. But that said, there were irritants. I think the new legislation coming out from the EU on deforestation issues needs to be communicated much better, and there needs to be more work from Europe to this part of the world about explaining themselves and offering help to make sure that the countries of this region can achieve the aims that Europe is trying to do. And Europe is no saint. Europe has non-tariff barriers as well, but they do have a lot less than you have in ASEAN. And of course, within Europe, it's a completely open market, so there are no NTBs.
Okay. The next question. Wait, okay. Thank you, Mr. Humphrey. I would like to another question. The question from Supriyanto, Institution Unikba. The question for Mr. Chris Humphrey. The first one, as we know that EAC or MEA is a cooperation of Asian countries in the economic field, but what is the role of student in this AEC? What kind of role is it? And the second question, what should students do at this AEC to get this benefit? Thank you.
Okay, the AEC is just one part of ASEAN community building. There are three pillars. There's the socio-cultural pillar, and there's also the political security pillar. Work for students often gets lumped under the social cultural pillar. I think the youth of ASEAN need to be pressing more for improvements in education systems in the region, more vocational training, more adaptability, more flexible approaches to education, so that they have the skill sets for the future. It is a cliche that the youth are our future, but they most definitely are our future. And ASEAN actually, for the moment, is a pretty young region, or they will be aging very rapidly very soon. But I think it's the students of the region need to be making themselves more relevant and getting their voices more heard and talking about the changes that they want to see coming out from economies in the region. And they need to have more opportunities, but they also need to be given the skill sets now to allow them to adapt for the future. And the future is going to be very fast paced. We've already seen that. Digital economy is going to take off even more. And the skill sets that often are being taught now will not be the ones that are relevant, I think, in 10 years' time.
Okay, we have to adapt it as a student because the future is very fast, especially for the economic. Okay, moving on to the next question. Next question. Okay. Okay, next question from GA English. The question will answer to Mr. Jeremy. Answer, Asian countries do some collaboration on investment with China related to infrastructure. Anyway, how do the investment policy that each Asian countries cannot trigger jealousy? Is there any MOU in Asian arrange how the Asian interests cannot be committed or detected by the superpower countries? And the second question, how the ASEAN transform itself in Revolution 4.0, okay, to support each member countries maintaining its economic become stable. As we know, in 1997, when the monetary crisis happened, start from Thailand, Thailand baht currency fall down and spread out all. Maybe for the first question, we'll answer with Mr. Menon. Please, Mr. Menon.
Okay, thank you for those questions. They are very big questions. I guess firstly on the first question relating to infrastructure investment, we know that the region has a huge deficit to be filled. There's various estimates floating around in the trillions. I won't go into exact numbers, because I think there's spurious accuracy here. But they're huge. And, I used to work at the Asian Development Bank until recently, before I took early retirement. And of course, they were mainly involved in financing infrastructure development. And I think the, new institutions have come in, such as the AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and the Belt and Road Initiative, which is China-led, etc. These are not, competitors, because the demand is so high that, even 10 AIIBs won't, 10 more AIIB will not fill that gap. So I think these are welcome initiatives in dealing with this huge demand and need going forward. I think the big question now is how this pans out in a post-pandemic new normal, where debt levels around the world have increased sharply, and with China slowing, we don't know really how that will pan out also, or how deep the drops will be. So there are uncertain times going forward in terms of China's role, but I think China will continue to be important in financing infrastructure in this region, and as will the other multilaterals. On the second question, so the digital stuff is very important. ASEAN has been slow. I think Chris mentioned this in many areas, and one of them is the digital area. It's been trying to get up to speed, keeping up with many of the bilateral agreements that are now proliferating as well. But I think as I said, the WTO ministerial coming up will say something about this. In fact, one of the important things there is this, the waiver on the customs duties on digital flows, which has every year it has to be renewed. For the first time, it might not be renewed. India and South Africa are claiming that, they're losing a lot of revenue as more things turn digital, which they cannot tax, when they used to be able to tax when they were delivered in a non-digital format. Things like, if you go to the cinema, you might pay a GST, but if you watch it on Netflix, you might not. That kind of stuff, and books and so on are digital now, so you can't tax them. So these things, I think, are being played out will be played out at the WTO ministerial. And I hope that the moratorium is renewed, because I don't think this is the time to be taxing these kinds of services. We'll have to wait and see. But the digital agenda is huge, a lot of work to be done. ASEAN is trying to catch up, but it has to move more quickly, I think. Yeah.
But Mr. Menon, what do you think about Indonesian, especially for the digital transformation? Because now we're working so hard for moving on to the digital transformation in this area.
Right, yes. So Indonesia, like a number of countries, has a national policy that tries to deal with these issues, which is a good thing. And of course, the challenges are huge, right? There's opportunities to leapfrog, of course. So there's a sort of latecomer advantage for these sort of developing countries, including Indonesia. And I think that will play out. But it's not just about individual country initiatives, but there's also a regional and global dimension, as I mentioned. So Indonesia, I think, will have to do a lot on the skills area. Training.
Are you optimistic?
Oh yes, one has to be optimistic about these things. I think Indonesia, can live up to the potential that it has. A lot of work to be done, but I think it has the potential. Sure, yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Menon, for your answer. Moving on to the next question from Ian or Elian Denika. From Chung University. The question is, will ASEAN remain solid with the establishment of AUKUS? Maybe Mr. Humphrey or Mr. Menon can answer the question.
I'll have a go at it first, if you like. I think AUKUS has been overstated as a concern for political reasons, quite honestly. There are already pre-existing arrangements between the three countries inside through other mechanisms. If you looked at this part of the world, there's the five powers issue, a pact in place with Malaysia, Singapore, with Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. I think I'd agree with what Jayan said during his earlier presentation. I think ASEAN will be here for a very long time, and as a region, I think it'll only get stronger. As a political grouping, it is pretty close. As an economic grouping, it should be closer. I don't see AUKUS being a major issue for ASEAN. I think ASEAN is very adept at making sure that it remains sitting on the fence and doesn't get into a position where it has to choose sides.
Maybe Mr. Menon want to add something?
I don't have much to add. I agree with everything that Chris just said. I think, AUKUS in a sense may highlight this concern of the white man's club, for want of a better term, right? Again, as part of this north-south split that we see playing out in so many forums, and it's not helpful. But I think ASEAN has the history and maturity, as Chris said, to deal with this, I think hopefully very soon we'll stop talking about AUKUS and focus on, getting on with the economic agenda.
It's very sensitive issue because there was one headline in online media. They'll talk about how the strengths of ASEAN facing the AUKUS. Okay, the next question from Havian Wahyudi. There is an example of experience that we can following for support ASEAN business that probably gonna drive the market. Mr. Menon?
Sorry, could you kindly repeat?
Okay, there is an example of experience that we can follow for support Asian business. Maybe we as a millennials, we as a Indonesian.
Oh, okay. Maybe Chris, I think, would be better. Sorry,
Okay,
not wanting to handball it to you, Chris, but on business side.
Thanks, Jayan. Yes. Okay. I'll go back to future skills. I think for that, you need, if you are looking to establish a business, if you are running a business now, you need to be very flexible in your approach. I think you need to do a lot of more investment these days, perhaps than in the past, in research and development, in market research, in developing new products, and then in how you're marketing them as well. These days, marketing is a very different game to what it used to be. So it's no more getting a few posters up on a billboard at the side of the road. You need to be much cleverer and utilizing marketing through digital means, I think, as well, particularly if you're trying to reach the younger audience going forward. And I think, though, that the younger audience, and that's your future consumers, are going to be a lot more demanding. They're going to be a lot more demanding in terms of delivery of services and delivery of goods, but also looking at the origins of where things are coming from, what's happening in the supply chains around it. And in that respect, I hesitate to say this because I don't like to say that you should be learning from Europe, but I think in this sense, the governments of the region need to be looking at what's going on elsewhere in the world in terms of legislation and trends and imparting those ideas onto their businesses as well.
Okay, two components, flexible and research are the main role for business now. Okay, moving on. The next question from Muhammad Akbar Jalal Wisesa from Universitas Negeri Malang. Hello, Malang. Okay, the question for Mr. Humphrey. What are the benefits if people join the Asian Economic Community or AEC? Can the lower class participate in the AEC or maybe only for the government?
AEC is very much a government-led idea. And my personal view is they don't involve the private sector enough in it, although they have got far better at it over the last few years, involving private sector groupings in their discussions. But the whole point of the AEC was to elevate economic development and help to remove poverty, particularly say in rural areas or in more impoverished areas, to try and get the less developed ASEAN countries to develop faster, and to try and, as I said at the beginning, have that single market and production base. The whole purpose of the AEC was economic development and to alleviate poverty and raise standards right across the region, and then therefore make the region collectively more relevant to the global trading community. The countries that are in it, some are doing better than others. Although if you look at growth rates, GDP growth rates pre-COVID, for the CLM in particular, were very, very impressive, and far more impressive than in the rest of ASEAN.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Humphrey. Next question from Alexa from SMAN 39. Senior High School. Okay. Hello, good morning. Allow me to ask some questions. There are three questions. The first one, why intra-ASEAN trade as a percentage of Asia's total trade has grown only marginally since late 1990s and has been virtually stagnant for the past decade? Maybe Mr. Menon will answer the question.
Right, yes. Thank you for the question. I think, as I was saying earlier, intra-ASEAN trade has been stubbornly low, and the more recent data that Chris actually showed us, it's actually been falling more recently. With the during the pandemic, and perhaps even before, not because of the pandemic, but even before the pandemic. So intra-ASEAN trade, I guess, is low or falling. Maybe part of it is also related to the story that Chris told, I think, very nicely, which is how, while tariffs have been falling very sharply, they've been multilateralized, those reductions, non-tariff barriers have been rising in this region. Maybe because tariffs are falling, but whatever the reason, they've been rising. And we know that non-tariff barriers can be a lot more, distorting than tariffs. But these tariffs, we can measure them, we can see them, we're pretty good at understanding its impacts. We can model these things quite well. Non-tariff barriers are opaque, they can change, they're moving target as well, and can have, very distorting impacts. If you go back to your Trade 101, if you remember, a binding quota has an effective rate of protection of infinity, right? So, and this is the concern. So maybe there are a lot of these non-tariff barriers that coming into play in affecting intra and extra-ASEAN trade. That's what we need to focus on going forward. And it's not an easy thing, but I think it's an important thing. And usually once you deal with these non-tariff barriers, then everyone benefits. It's very difficult to prevent free riding, which is a good thing in this case. So when you remove a non-tariff barrier, it's then the benefits flow to both members and non-members of ASEAN, because it's either difficult or costly to prevent free riding. So that's actually a good kind of free riding in this case. But I think, yeah, that might be one of the reasons why the intra-ASEAN trade has been stagnant or more recently falling, and it's something that we have to look at. I agree with Chris that non-tariff measures are a separate thing. They are a sign of maturity in the regulatory process, and they're designed to serve very good purposes. It's when non-tariff barriers are exploited or abused, and they become, non-tariff measures are exploited or abused, and they become non-tariff measures, barriers, barriers that we need to be concerned about. When NTMs become NTBs, that's the problem, and often that can happen. That's the challenge for ASEAN as it is for the rest of the world. The real issue now is not really tariffs anymore, but non-tariff barriers. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, maybe Mr. Humphrey wants to add something.
Just to say, I 100% agree with what Jan just said. Actually, I couldn't have said it better myself.
Okay. Moving on to the next question. Okay, but my question before moving on the next question, my question is, what the obstacle that Asian really face today after the pandemic? I don't know what's the obstacle we will face.
I think coming out of the pandemic, the obstacle that ASEAN faces is itself. Actually, it's the most disappointing thing about last year in this region was it was every man for himself, rather than trying to do things collectively. And it took until the back end of 2020 for them to come up even with a very short, brief, essential goods list, because when the pandemic hit and borders were closed, things really weren't moving at all in the region. And there was no sense of community of working together. And I think that is ASEAN's biggest obstacle to get over. They really, this should have been an opportunity for them to show we are 10, we can work together, we're going to hold hands, we're going to get through this together. And I think it was an opportunity missed. And I hope that the work they're now doing through the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework and their most recent announcements about doing more things on future pandemic planning together can actually bring them together and get over that obstacle.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Humphrey, and maybe Mr. Menon. Before we end the session, maybe you can talk about Asian future and during the pandemic or after the pandemic.
Sure. So let me pick up from where Chris left off. I agree with Chris that ASEAN's response has been disappointing, but so has the global community, right? So ASEAN is basically, in a sense, mirrored what's happened with other regional and global institutions. This was a global pandemic that would have been best addressed by a coordinated global response, as we have been doing quite well in the past globally. I mean, with SARS, with of course the global financial crisis. This time around, the G7 couldn't even come out with a communique because President Trump insisted on using Wuhan virus in it, and those kind of silliness. I mean, but so the global response has been wanting, and this is again, I think, symptomatic of this sort of breakdown in rules-based multilateralism to some extent. But I think again has been reflective of that general trend. But I think going forward, ASEAN and other regional groupings have to ensure that the barriers raised in the name of the pandemic don't stay in place for longer than they need to be. And here, particularly, I'm concerned about labor mobility, which is very important to labor exporting countries like Indonesia, Philippines. In fact, also important to labor importing countries, right? So to everyone. So, it's fine to say, well, we have to close borders while a pandemic is raging. Not that it's actually, I think, helped very much, but that's a separate issue, which will take too long to get into. But I think these factor barriers need to come down, and the sooner the better, especially during a difficult adjustment phase as we try and recover from this devastating pandemic, the economic effects of this pandemic. And that's where ASEAN must play a role, and other regional groupings must play a role. And if we can't bring down those barriers on capital and labor, we must at least keep trade flowing, because trade can partially substitute for factor mobility. The wages on labor and returns on capital can equalize even without capital or labor moving if you have trade growing. So this is, one of the this is a factor price equalization theorem that some of you might still remember, again from Trade 101. But the point is that it does happen in the real world. Trade does equalize these prices, and it does reduce adjustment costs. So that's where I think ASEAN must continue to play a role in the future, but its future will be defined in the context of other broader groupings like RCEP, and how it stands up in global forums like the WTO. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. ASEAN definitely can survive and will be defined by how it manages its role in the evolving regional and global. For business now, you have to be flexible and more research. Thank you very much, Mr. Chris Humphrey. Thank you very much, Mr. Jayan Menon. And thank you for all the participants. And I would like to say sorry if we cannot read all the questions because the time is very tight, but I hope you enjoy our session from this morning to the end. Thank you very much, Mr. Chris Humphrey, Mr. Jayan Menon, and I'm Audrey Chandra signing out. Back to you, our MC for today, Mr. Agung. Stay healthy and happy. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Audrey Chandra, for facilitating us the panel presentation. And also thank you for Mr. Jayan Menon and Mr. Chris Humphrey. That very insightful presentation. And we're gonna move to the next agenda, which is the announcement for the winners of scientific competition and infographic competition, as well as the awarding of prizes for the winners. I invite Aura as a chief of this event to announce the winner. To Aura, the time is yours.
Okay, thank you, Agung, for this opportunity. As a project leader, I feel very proud of the participants who have enthusiastically participated in the IER competition. IER has 4 competitions, and now I will announce 2 competitions in the ASEAN College Student category based on the final decision the scientific paper competition, which has been participated by students from various universities. The finalists have gone through the full paper selection stage at a fairly competitive presentation. And now, please, the operator, we can slide, next slide. So the first, I'm gonna to announce from the second runner-up. So the second runner-up of the scientific paper competition, Indonesian Economic Review 6.0 is Tim Niluh Madayani from Pertamina University with the member Gusti Ayu Kadek Chandra Oktaviani Mahadewi and Olivia Gloria Setiawan with the title Pemanfaatan BUMDes dengan Strategi Pemasaran EWOM sebagai pendongkrak perekonomian nasional di tengah ketidakpastian dunia. Okay, congrats to the team. And next, I will announce from the first runner-up. The first runner-up scientific paper competition Indonesian Economic Review 6.0 is Tim Sonia Putri from University of Airlangga with the member Syahra Salsabila and Adinda Alifatul Maula with the title Simulation Tools Supporting Project-Based Learning Education System to Create Excellent Human Resource. Okay, and what we are mosting for the winner of scientific paper competition Indonesian Economic Review 6.0 is Adrian from University of North Sumatra with the member Basauli Siregar and Muhammad Dimas with the title Immunomodulator Coffee Innovation to Increase the Body's Immunity as a New Business Opportunity in the Middle of the COVID-19 Pandemic. Okay, congratulations to the winner. And also, I still have one champion for the favorite team. So, for the favorite team of scientific paper competition Indonesian Economic Review 6.0 is Tim Rasel Ariela from Pertamina University with the member Disa Tunisa Empah and Menase Daud Immanuel with the title Peran Pemerintah dalam Menghadapi Resesi Ekonomi di Tengah Pandemi, Studi Kasus Indonesia dan Singapura. Okay, congratulations to the winner. So next, I will move on to the next competition. Okay, first I'm gonna to announce from the second runner-up. And the second runner-up of the infographic competition Indonesian Economic Review 6.0 is Tim Nima Dewi Radwiratna Pratiani from University of Udayana with a member Anak Agung Sania Arnaya Putri and Kadek Agus Yoga Adriana with the title Facing Global Uncertainty Era to End Poverty Through SDGs. Okay, congratulations team. And next, the first runner-up for infographic competition Indonesian Economic Review 6.0 is Tim Divamika from Pertamina University with the member Kaisa Hilary Pangalila and Sharon Esther Hermian Carlos with the title Shining Bright Solar Energy. Okay, and what we have been waiting for, the winner of infographic competition Indonesian Economic Review 6.0 is Tim Koriato Septiavin from Pertamina University with the member Aurelia Jessica Fabiola with the title Energy Security in Population Growth, a Problem for ASEAN. So congratulations to the team, and I will announce to the favorite team. And favorite team of infographic competition Indonesian Economic Review 6.0 is Tim Pande Putu Sastra Wibawa from Isi Denpasar with the member Niputu Dea Pramesti and Igusti Ngurah Piantara with the title Smart City Beats the Uncertainty. Okay, congratulations winner. And that's all of me. I back to the MC. Thank you.
Thank you, Aura, and congratulations for all the winners. And next, I will announce the two best questions in today's webinar. The first is French GA from English Confidence, and the second is Supriyanto from Unikba. For French GA and Supriyanto, please contact the committee for taking your prize. And to all participants, I invite you to fill the link feedback on your screen or in chat box. We hope that all participants can give a good suggestion for this event to be better in next event. And I remind you again, to all participants, you can make Insta story on your Instagram and tag Indonesian Economic Review Instagram, and the 3 best Insta story will be chosen and will get a door prize from the committee. And now, I invite to all participants to photo group session. Please open your camera and put your best smile. Okay, I will count 1, 2, and 3. One more, please. Okay. 1, 2, 3. Thank you to all participants. Today's webinar, Indonesian Economic Review 6.0, delivered by Mr. Jayan Menon and Mr. Chris Humphrey, attended by more than 200 participants from various institutions. We truly hope that you have had a fruitful experience of learning, sharing, and networking. Ladies and gentlemen, however, we are now has reached an end of today's webinar. Finally, on behalf of Universitas Pertamina, I would like to express my gratitude to the speakers and my appreciation to all the participants. We wish you always safe and healthy. Have a good day and see you tomorrow at the second day webinar. Thank you.